Hello, I'm Esther Githu. It's Thursday, December 8th. This is Africa 54.
Nigeria's top general says he refuses to investigate a Reuters report alleging the military ran a secret abortion program for almost 10 years. The U.S. African Leaders Summit, which starts next week, is meant to build partnerships between African entrepreneurs and American investors, as VOA's Ndiho reports. 2022 was a year of economic crisis, fueled in large part by the pandemic and the February Russian attack upon Ukraine, as Henry Ridgwell details. All this and much more on today's Africa 54.
We begin in West Africa, where a Reuters news agency report says since at least 2013, the Nigerian army has run a secret, systematic and illegal abortion program in the country's northeast. According to that report, at least 10,000 pregnancies among women and girls were terminated. The Nigerian military authorities have rejected the Reuters report. Africa 54's Ndiho has more.
Nigerian military leaders have denied reports that since 2013, the army has run a secret, systematic and illegal abortions program in the country's northeast, terminating nearly 10,000 pregnancies, according to dozens of witness accounts and documentation reviewed by Reuters.
It has never happened, it is not happening, and it will not happen. It is not in our character. We are highly professional, we are human beings, and these are Nigerians they have been talking about.
The abortions were mainly carried out without the person's consent and often without their prior knowledge, according to witness accounts. The women and girls ranged from a few weeks to 8 months pregnant. Some were as young as 12 years old. Fati was rescued by Nigerian soldiers and recounted her ordeal.
Boko Haram came and attacked. They grabbed us and took us away to the bush. After that, we were in the bush, in their hands. Soldiers came and took us. After that, they took us to Giwa barracks, and they aborted our pregnancies.
The campaign relied on deception and physical force against some women in military custody for days or weeks. In some instances, women who resisted were beaten, caned, held at gunpoint, or dragged into compliance. Others were tied or pinned down as abortion drugs were inserted into them. 4 soldiers and 1 guard said superiors told them the program was needed to destroy insurgent fighters before they could be born.
There are those who are given pills. There are those who, they open their thighs and they put something in there and twist it, like those things butchers use, like scissors. They push it inside and twist it. You'll see her scream as they're moving it inside of her. Then they'll tell her to get up, and that's it.
At least 300,000 people have died since the conflict began, some due to violence, and many more from starvation and disease, according to the United Nations human rights groups.
They gave us injections. I didn't even know I was pregnant. The injection they gave me, I lost the pregnancy. I felt like I needed to pee, so I went outside towards the stream, away from the building. I squatted down, and then blood just started coming out. Turns out it was the pregnancy, but I didn't know. I came back and told them how I was feeling, but still I didn't know. They told us they would give us an injection, but they didn't tell us what it was. But they said it was even better it's aborted.
In Washington, State Department's spokesperson Ned Price says the United States is seeking further information on the Reuters report.
My reaction to it in the first instance was a personal one, in that I read it and was deeply disturbed by it. It was a harrowing report. It's a concerning report, and for that reason we are seeking further information, but I just don't have anything to offer at this time.
The investigation is based on interviews with 33 women and girls who say they underwent abortions while in the custody of the Nigerian army. Reuters has also interviewed civilian health workers and security personnel involved in the program escorting pregnant women to abortion sites. Paul Ndiho, VOA News, Washington.
The United Nations mission in South Sudan, UNMISS, through its conduct and discipline team, convened and connected with women's representatives in Gurey, Juba, to organize a stand-down day designed to raise awareness on the need for collective action to uphold the rights of women. Led by UNMISS conduct and discipline team, the activity was held under the gambit of the ongoing 16 days of activism. Local communities, women groups, representatives from UNMISS and UN agencies, funds and program joined hands in the event. In South Sudan, the world's newest nation, women and girls have been disproportionately impacted by years of civil war and conflict.
Sexual exploitation and abuse is another form of gender-based violence. So the conduct and discipline team has organized a stand-down day where we can come and celebrate this with the women. We talk about sexual exploitation and abuse. We tell them what the strategies of the UN are. But most importantly, they are our partners in the field. They are the ones who communicate with the community. They are the ones who are in the community. So we need their assistance for us to be able to carry out our mandate to fight against sexual exploitation and abuse.
Attendees were asked to ensure prompt reporting of any instance of sexual exploitation and abuse through community focal points using a designated hotline. A report by the United Nations issued Thursday says the M23 armed group in the Democratic Republic of Congo executed at least 131 villagers in reprisal killings late last month as part of a campaign of murder, rape, kidnapping and looting. Initial investigations by the UN peacekeeping mission and the Joint Human Rights Office into the November 29th and 30th massacres in the villages of Kishishe and Bambo found they were undertaken in retaliation for clashes between M23 and rival armed groups. Recent offensives have uprooted thousands of civilians and sparked a diplomatic spat with neighboring Rwanda, which Congo and UN experts accuse of backing the militia. Rwanda denies any involvement. The U.S. Africa Leaders Summit, scheduled for December 13th to the 15th in Washington, D.C., will bring together African heads of state and government and African entrepreneurs to advance mutually beneficial partnerships that create jobs and drive inclusive and sustainable growth on both sides of the Atlantic. Analysts say there are high hopes and expectations on whether this long-standing commitment to Africa strengthens the ties between the United States and the African nations. For more insight, Africa 54's Paul Ndiho caught up with Nee Simmons, a business analyst based here in Washington.
It's a really great way to support, to use U.S. hegemony, U.S. leadership to bring all these allies together to support all these countries. And you know, how can the diaspora who are in the U.S. Working at U.S. companies be used as a leverage to support this? So the U.S. government has a really good chance to, you know, take, you know, you mentioned the aforementioned U.S. Africa Trade Summit during Biden administration 2014. That summit in itself was long overdue. What does that mean? We just don't want, you know, I think we can't just sit back and just let these countries come to us and just ask the U.S. for budget support or monetary support. We need to also put the task to say, okay, well, what are your future goals? What's your 10-year goal to support infrastructure development? But at the same time, I think Africans also need to, you know, we need to put these countries on notice and make sure that, you know, it's not the same it's not the same old business as come to the West, beg for money, and then go back and then do the same thing 4 or 5 years later. The diaspora really needs to engage and incentivize some of these countries to really do things differently and in a more systematic manner and make sure it's sustainable.
There are some interesting areas that this particular summit will be focusing on. They're going to be focusing on entrepreneurship on the continent. How can the U.S. help young people? They're also talking about innovation. They're looking across the continent, looking for young, innovative minds. It looks like they're shifting from looking at the leaders, the leadership on the continent, but also putting their attention or focusing on the young people, what young people are doing across the continent.
That's a very good point, Paul. Look, that not only needs to be done, it needs to be a tool to not only encourage but incentivize. But I think there needs to be some language to say, well, look, you have to have a mandate to engage youth. There has to be if you're providing healthcare or any type of program through USAID, there has to be a youth component. What does that mean? Youth has to be employed. The U.S. government needs to, find ways to use its current systems to engage youth, because if you put that into a USAID package, right? By definition, there's so many. And you can create jobs overnight.
Thank you so much for your time, Neil.
Thank you so much, Paul. Appreciate it.
That was Africa 54's Paul Ndiho speaking to Neil Simmons, a business analyst based here in Washington, D.C. For more perspective on the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit, I'm joined by Rahma Wright, Chief Executive Officer, Yelin Enterprises. Rahma is a member of the President's Advisory Council on Doing Business in Africa, where she advises U.S. President Joe Biden through the Secretary of Commerce on ways to strengthen commercial engagement between the United States and African countries. Rahma, it's a pleasure to have you in the studio today.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start right there, where your job is about strengthening the commercial engagement between African countries and the U.S. What does that really entail?
Yeah, well, the President's Advisory Council on Doing Business in Africa is one way of doing that. It was established in 2014 under the Obama administration, and it is a way for the private sector to engage with the public sector in terms of providing recommendations and helping to guide U.S. trade engagement strategy. So what we do is we meet, we look at various sectors, whether it's health, agriculture, women, SMEs, and it's made up of different sized businesses. So very large companies to smaller companies like myself. And it's a really amazing opportunity to provide insights into the experiences that we're having engaging with trade in Africa.
So you've been on the park several years now, I believe so. And but how is your enterprise? You just mentioned it barely, but how does your enterprise tie into this kind of summit? This is high profile, so many African leaders coming to the U.S. and so much to talk about.
Yeah, you're right. I was appointed during the inaugural establishment of the President's Advisory Council because of the fact that I work and build ethical supply chains that incorporate women-owned cooperatives into my business model. So my company, we source plant-based African ingredients, shea butter right now, from northern Ghana, working in communities of where the product originates from. And we help women take a raw material, transform it into a value-added product that we then incorporate into a line of personal care, so body moisturizers and cleansers. And by doing that, it increases women's income 5 times their country's minimum wage. And so that connection between local rural women and the work that they're doing and connecting it to U.S. markets is part of the contributions I make on the Advisory Council, really figuring out how to establish African products in the U.S. market that also benefits local communities.
And that's what we'll be looking at as this summit kicks off. But tell us a little bit about your connection to the continent of Africa.
Oh, I have a deep connection. I'm Ghanaian on my mom's side. And for me, I've always, ever since I was little, I knew I would work in Africa. I've had the opportunity to travel to 20 countries on the continent. One day, I hope to travel to all 54. And for me, I think it's so important being part of the diaspora to utilize the resources and the tools that I have to reach back and contribute to economic and trade development in Africa.
So looking at what has happened to the globe because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the impact has really hit the continent of Africa very hard.
Yeah.
What do you expect that is going to be different in this summit when these African leaders begin the summit with the United States?
Yeah, well, actually, I think that Africa as a whole responded much better to COVID-19 than a lot of other regions. And I don't think Africans are being given enough credit for the fact that they did not see a widespread of the numbers that you saw in other parts of the world. One of the things that's different in terms of the U.S. Africa Business Forum, which is happening next week in Washington, D.C., is the engagement of the diaspora. In previous forums, they didn't have an agenda item that focused on diaspora and the civil society, but now they do. And for the first time, you'll be able to see an entire day's event surrounding the diaspora, surrounding youth and SMEs, and also engaging the civil society.
When you talk about commercial enterprise and engagement between the continent and Africa, a lot of African leaders are expecting to see what the U.S. would want them to, trade in with the U.S. and what in return, they might want to get out of the United States. Maybe give us a little highlight on what happens here.
Yeah, so I think that having these types of initiatives and these forums and these dialogue is the first step. We want to have trade engagement that's mutually beneficial, trade engagement that supports job creation here in the U.S. as well as job creation in Africa. And being able to bring decision makers in the same room, not only the public sector but also the private sector, allows for the dialogue to happen, for conversation to happen, so that there can be priorities established from both sides so that everyone's interests is included in the strategies and the signing of the various MOUs and the decisions that will be made.
We're looking forward to it. The Voice of America will be covering this summit extensively. And right here on Africa 54 as well. Thank you very much, Rahma.
Thank you for having me.
Rahma Wright is a Chief Executive Officer, Yelin Enterprises, and a member of the President's Advisory Council on Doing Business in Africa. We reached out to a number of people across African cities to get their thoughts on the upcoming U.S. Africa Summit. Take a look.
My message to President Biden and the United States at large is that we as Rwandans and Africans, we welcome the partnership of the United States and African countries. The Biden administration needs to strive to make sure that the partnership of the United States and Africans is based on mutual understanding, respect for values and the cultures of course, the United States and African states as well.
The message I have for the United States and for President Joe Biden is that they need to take accountability for the roles they've played in countries of war and countries of unrest, such as Palestine, Syria, and Iraq. They have a responsibility as a first world country to provide aid where aid is needed.
The U.S. need to do everything possible to make sure things that directly or indirectly happen to us are actually something we are meaningfully engaged, especially putting us at the center of every action or decision they take, especially issues around challenges the world faces, in issues around humanitarian crisis, insecurity, food, health, and also even climate change. I think these are things we directly or indirectly contribute. So they must make sure that we actually do something on it and also meaningfully engage us in it.
People in African cities sharing their thoughts on the upcoming U.S. Africa Summit here in Washington, D.C. We're excited to hear what you think about Africa 54 and all our VOA Africa programs on our website at voaafrica.com. Still to come, a look at how the global economy was gripped by an economic crisis as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. We'll be right back.
Gender-based violence is rising worldwide, but according to the United Nations, the East and Southern Africa regions have higher rates of sexual violence against women. On this week's episode of Our Voices, we will look at the various factors that has led to the rise in gender-based violence in sub-Saharan Africa. We will also ask experts for their ideas on how to step up the fight on sexual violence against women and hear from the people on the continent about ongoing efforts to support survivors. Join the conversation each week right here on Our Voices.
In other news, the South African government on Thursday apologized to the country after a prolonged energy crisis took a turn for the worse, with beleaguered utility Eskom forced to ramp up power cuts nationwide. Violence in South Sudan's Upper Nile state has killed an unknown number of people and displaced just over 9,000, some of whom are hiding in swamps, according to the United Nations agencies. Moscow exchanges a U.S. basketball star, Brittney Griner, who had been jailed in Russia for notorious arms trafficker Victor Bout, who was serving a 25-year sentence here in the United States. Janusz Wallace, the man who assassinated South African anti-apartheid hero Chris Hani nearly 3 decades ago, has been released on parole, according to authorities. David Doyle has more.
A far-right extremist who assassinated South African anti-apartheid leader Chris Hani has been released on parole, authorities said on Wednesday. Janusz Wallace was granted parole by the Constitutional Court in late November, having served nearly 30 years of a life sentence for Hani's murder. That decision sparked street protests in South Africa. Hani was a senior member of the now ruling African National Congress and head of the South African Communist Party. He was shot dead by Wallace outside Hani's home in Johannesburg in 1993. The killing triggered nationwide riots that threatened to derail South Africa's transition to multiracial democracy after decades of white minority rule under apartheid. A statement from the Ministry of Justice and Correctional Services said Wallace's parole takes effect from December the 7th. It said he will serve 2 years under community corrections in line with the parole regime upon which he is released. Wallace was initially expected to be released last week, but was admitted to hospital after being stabbed by a fellow prison inmate.
That was David Doyle of Reuters reporting. The global economy was gripped by an economic crisis in 2022 as the aftermath of the coronavirus pandemic was exacerbated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which sent energy prices soaring. Henry Ridgwell reports from London.
Obeng Kramper imports second-hand furniture to sell in his home city of Accra, but he's struggling to balance the books. Inflation in Ghana has hit 40% this year, and the currency has almost halved in value against the US dollar.
The amount you use to import, let's say 1 container, these days you have to double the amount. The same goods, the same quantity, but the amount has been doubled.
Across the world, central banks have imposed sharp rate rises to try to tame inflation driven by soaring energy costs. The US Federal Reserve raised interest rates 6 times in 2022, strengthening the dollar.
People buy goods, they sell goods, but there is a difference in time between them. If during that time the currency changes, the manufacturer or the buyer can lose money. And all this, remember, is also tied to inflation. And not just inflation, but expectations of inflation. So how, if I'm selling burgers, how much should I price them now? Or should I keep changing the price every day?
The uncertainty has hit the world economy, forecast to grow just 2.2% in 2023, down from over 5% last year.
Rising global interest rates are increasing the cost of borrowing, putting many households, firms and governments under increased pressure. Russia's war against Ukraine has also worsened the conditions for low-income countries. Many of them are particularly vulnerable to high food and energy prices, and in addition, tighter global financial conditions raise the risk of further debt distress in those countries.
That distress is felt acutely in Sri Lanka, which is suffering its worst financial crisis since independence in 1948. The government defaulted on its debts in May as inflation hit 70%.
We can't afford to buy chicken, fish, or any other meat. We only eat vegetables and leaves. It is difficult for us to even send our children to schools and even provide them proper meals. We are going through a very hard time.
Across the world, workers are demanding better pay as inflation eats into their wages. In Britain, nurses and ambulance workers are set to stage strikes in December.
I've had to cut down on a lot of things with the kids, which I can't afford to provide for them because of the high cost of living.
Inflation is forecast to fall back slightly in 2023, but with the war in Ukraine still raging and energy prices high, the new year will bring little relief for the billions of people struggling to get by. Henry Ridgwell for VOA News, London.
And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, thanks for watching.